The air was sharp with the scent of pine and frost, and each step crunched in the brittle snow. I had planned this trip to escape everything, to let the cold, unyielding wilderness strip away the noise of my life in Seattle. The breakup, the arguments, the silence that followed. I thought a weekend in the Montana backcountry would clear my head. I didn't expect it to turn into a fight for my safety. By midday, the sky had shifted from pale blue to an ominous steel gray. Clouds pressed low, swallowing the mountains in a thick haze. My phone had no service hours ago, but now its battery was nearly gone. I checked my map for the 5th time, realizing I'd veered off the marked trail without noticing. I told myself I wasn't lost, just misplaced. Still, the creeping weight in my chest said otherwise. The wind picked up, howling through the trees like something alive. I was moving too quickly, anxious to find the trail again, when my foot caught on a hidden root under the snow. I fell hard, my knee smashing against a frozen rock. Pain radiated up my leg, sharp and immediate. I swore under my breath, testing my weight on it. It held, but barely. I could walk, but not far. The snow deepened as I limped forward, each step slower than the last. When the first flakes of the storm began to fall, panic curled cold in my stomach. I didn't have the gear for an unplanned night outdoors, and I knew the temperature would drop fast. That's when I saw movement between the trees. At first, I thought it was a deer. But then a figure emerged, broad-shouldered, tall, wearing a weathered canvas jacket and a rifle slung over his back. His boots sank deep into the snow as he approached with a steady, unhurried pace. "You all right?" His voice was deep, rough, and carried easily over the wind. I hesitated, unsure whether relief or wariness should win. I twisted my knee, lost the trail. He studied me for a beat longer than felt necessary, his gaze unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. "Storm's rolling in. You won't make it far on that leg. My cabin's not too far from here. You should come." It was the kind of offer you were warned never to accept from strangers, but the wind bit through my jacket and my knee was screaming. The sky had already darkened to an early dusk. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. "Lead the way," I said. He nodded once, then turned without another word. I followed, my breath puffing in ragged clouds, the snow beginning to thicken. We moved through a dense stand of firs until a small clearing opened ahead. There it was, a squat log cabin, smoke curling from a narrow chimney. A split-rail fence lined the edge of the property, half buried in snow. Inside, the air was warm and smelled faintly of wood smoke and something savory. He closed the door behind us, shaking the snow from his shoulders before hanging his rifle on a wall rack. "Sit," he said, motioning to a chair near the fire. I eased into it, the heat seeping gratefully into my frozen hands. He crouched to throw another log on the flames, and in the flicker of light, I saw him more clearly. Sharp jawline dusted with stubble, eyes the color of wet earth, hair tucked under his hat, but dark at the edges. "I'm Ronan," he said, finally, as if the introduction were an afterthought. "Caleb," I replied. He gave a short nod, then stood and moved to a small counter, ladling something from a pot into a mug. He handed it to me, thick stew, rich and hot. "You were hunting?" I asked, trying to fill the silence. "Elk," he said simply, "but this storm will keep them bedded down. You'll be here for the night." There was no question in his tone, just a statement of fact. I should have been unsettled by his certainty, but the truth was I was exhausted, and the thought of braving the snow again felt impossible. The wind rattled the windows, and for a moment neither of us spoke. I watched the firelight dance across the lines of his face, the flicker revealing something hard there, but not unkind. He caught me looking and didn't look away right away. "You're lucky I found you," he said after a long pause. "Most folks get turned around out here. They don't walk back out." "Guess I owe you then," I said. His mouth curved into the faintest hint of a smile. "Maybe." I couldn't tell if it was the heat from the fire or the way he said it, but something in me stirred, unexpected and uneasy. I had no idea who Ronan really was, or why fate had decided to put me in his path, but as the storm pressed harder against the cabin walls, I knew my night was now tied to his, and I wasn't sure if that was a blessing or the start of something I'd regret. By morning, the storm had buried the world outside in a heavy white silence. The windows were frosted at the edges, and the air inside the cabin smelled faintly of coffee and wood smoke. I woke to the sound of something clinking against metal, Ronan at the stove, stirring a battered tin pot with the same quiet precision he seemed to bring to everything. "You're up," he said without looking over. "Yeah," I murmured, my voice still rough from sleep. The knee throbbed when I shifted, a dull ache that reminded me I was at the mercy of both the weather and the man across the room. He poured coffee into a chipped mug and slid it across the table toward me. The steam rose in thin, curling threads, and I wrapped my hands around it like it was the only warm thing in the world. "I can help with something," I offered, but he shook his head. "You need to rest that leg," he said. "I got things covered." It wasn't dismissive, more like a quiet insistence. There was no arguing with him, so I didn't. Instead, I watched the way he moved, deliberate but unhurried, as if time obeyed him instead of the other way around. When we finally sat to eat, the conversation came slowly, like testing the ice before stepping onto a frozen lake. He asked where I'd been hiking from, and I told him about the trailhead, about the weekend I'd planned alone. When I mentioned the breakup, I did it lightly, as though it were an old bruise instead of the fresh wound it was. "You came out here to forget," he said. "It wasn't a question." Something like that, I replied, studying the way the firelight caught in his eyes. He didn't share much about himself at first, just that he'd been in Montana for 3 years, that he hunted and trapped when the season was right, that the cabin had been his father's before him. But there were gaps in his words, little shadows where the light didn't quite reach. After breakfast, the wind eased enough for us to step outside. The snow was waist-deep in places, soft and blinding under the morning sun. Ronan handed me his spare coat, thick, heavy, smelling faintly of cedar, and I slipped it on without protest. We gathered firewood from the lean-to, the silence between us stretching long but not uncomfortable. He showed me how to split the logs along their grain, the swing of his axe smooth and exact. My knee limited what I could do, but I carried what I could manage, feeling oddly grateful to be given a task at all. Inside again, the day moved at its own rhythm. He worked on repairing a loose hinge on the door, and I found myself watching the muscles in his forearm shift with each turn of the screwdriver. Now and then he'd glance up at me with a quick, unreadable expression, as though catching a thought mid-flight. At one point, a crackle from the old two-way radio broke the quiet. A man's voice came through low, brief, and tense. Ronan responded in the same clipped tone, the words too fast for me to catch. When I asked about it, he said it was just a supply check from a neighbor. The explanation was simple enough, but his eyes didn't quite match his voice when he said it. That night, the wind returned, pressing against the cabin in heavy gusts. We sat by the fire after dinner, the only light coming from the flames. The air between us felt heavier than before, not in a way that pushed me back, but in a way that drew me forward without asking, "Do you get many people out here?" I asked. "Not the kind who stay," he said, his gaze fixed on the fire. There was more he could have said, but he didn't. I didn't push. As the storm deepened outside, I felt the strange certainty that I was meant to be here, that whatever this was between us had been waiting for me long before I took the wrong turn on the trail. But underneath that certainty, a quieter thought settled in, one I didn't yet understand. Some rescues, I would later learn, come with a cost. That night, the wind softened to a restless whisper, and the fire burned low. Ronan poured 2 fingers of whiskey into tin cups, the amber liquid catching what little light there was. He handed me one and took the chair across from mine, his posture loose, but his gaze steady. We drank in silence for a while, the warmth of the whiskey sinking into my bones. "I was the one who broke it. I never thanked you," I said, "for finding me. For this." His eyes flicked up, and something unreadable moved behind them. "You don't need to thank me," he said, but his voice was softer than usual. I told him things I hadn't planned to, about the relationship I'd left behind. The way I'd been drifting for months, the gnawing sense that I'd lost my footing in more ways than one. He listened without interrupting, his expression shifting only in small ways, like the tightening of his jaw or the faint crease between his brows. When I finished, he leaned back, his cup cradled in one hand. I don't let people in, Caleb. Not often. Not anymore. But his gaze caught mine and held it. You feel different. The words hit with an unexpected weight. I felt my chest tighten in a way I didn't want to name, not yet. Later, while he tended the fire, I wandered to a shelf cluttered with old books and framed photographs. Most were of the cabin or the surrounding wilderness, but one stopped me cold, a recent picture of Ronan with another man. They stood close, laughing, the kind of closeness that didn't need explaining if you'd ever felt it yourself. I held the frame in my hands longer than I should have. "Who's this?" I asked when Ronan turned. He glanced at it, then back to me, his expression flattening. "Just a friend." The answer came too quickly, too lightly. I set the frame back, but the thought stuck like a burr. The rest of the evening felt different, his silences heavier, mine sharper. I tried to tell myself it didn't matter. We'd known each other for barely 2 days. But in the small world of that cabin, 2 days felt like something more. Later, as the night deepened, I woke to the faint crackle of the radio. Ronan's voice was low but urgent, and I caught the same man's voice in reply. The one from the photo. I couldn't hear everything, but fragments slipped through. "Tomorrow, wait for me. Don't let him." I lay still, the cold from the floorboards creeping into my back, my pulse loud in my ears. When the cabin went quiet again, I closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come. The next afternoon, the storm broke. From the window, I saw a figure moving across the snow, bundled against the wind. As he came closer, my stomach turned. It was the man from the photograph. I stepped back from the glass before Ronan could see me watching. My mind was already moving ahead, fitting pieces together in ways I didn't want to believe. Whatever this was between Ronan and me, I had the sinking feeling it was about change. The knock at the cabin door was muffled by the wind, but it still carried an urgency that made my pulse jump. Ronan crossed the room without looking at me and opened it to let the man in. Snow clung to his beard and the folds of his coat, his eyes darting to me briefly before settling on Ronan. "This is Caleb," Ronan said, his tone neutral. "Caleb, this is Mark." Mark gave me a quick nod, but there's no warmth in it. He was focused on Ronan, speaking in a low, urgent voice I couldn't quite make out. They moved to the corner near the radio, their words drowned by the crackle of the fire and the wind rattling the window panes. I tried not to watch, but my gaze kept returning to them, their closeness, the way Ronan's hand brushed Mark's arm as if to steady him. Something in me twisted. I'd been here 2 nights, felt something building between us, but now I wasn't sure if I'd been imagining all of it. When they finally rejoined me, Ronan said, "Mark's here to pick something up. Supplies. He'll take you back to town. Your knee won't handle the hike." The decision was made for me, as though my presence was just another item on his list to be handled. I forced a nod, but my chest felt tight. "Right." While Mark stepped outside to check his truck, I turned to Ronan. "You could have told me. About him. About whatever this is." His jaw worked, and for the first time since I met him, he looked away instead of holding my gaze. "It wasn't supposed to matter. You weren't supposed to stay." The words landed like a blow. So, what was this? Keeping me here until he showed up? Was I just convenient? He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling hard. "It wasn't like that. I didn't plan on." He stopped himself, shaking his head. "I like you, Caleb. I didn't expect to. But Mark needed time, and I couldn't just... I waited for the rest, but it never came." Mark returned, calling from the doorway that the truck was warming up. I grabbed my pack, my movement stiff. Ronan didn't try to stop me. Outside, the air was brutally cold, the snow blinding under a thin break in the clouds. I climbed into the passenger seat of Mark's truck, the engine rumbling under us. As we pulled away, I glanced back at the cabin. Ronan stood in the doorway, hands buried in his coat pockets, his face unreadable in the distance. The road wound through the pines, and the cabin disappeared from view. My knee ached, but the dull throb in my chest was worse. Back in town hours later, the streets were wet with melting snow. Mark dropped me off without ceremony, and I stood there for a moment, unsure of where to go next. I'd been rescued. Yes, but I wasn't sure from what, or if I'd just been set adrift again. That night, in the small room I rented above a diner, I sat by the window and watched the snow fall under the streetlight. I thought of the firelight in Ronan's eyes, the way his voice softened when he said my name, the half-smile he'd worn that first night. Some rescues save your life. Others just remind you how easily it can be taken apart.